Hello everyone, this is Arman with MetaSpike. I see a number of attendees here, so if somebody could give me a sound check to make sure my sound is coming through and we're on, I'll get started. Let's see, I see. All right. Thank you, Kara. So thank you for joining. We've had a few webinars before, two webinars before, which were mainly kind of like an overview of what you can accomplish with a tool like Forensic Email Collector and general functionality overview. This is more intended for our existing users, so my plan here is to focus on the details of what Forensic Email Collector does and how it does it, answer some of your questions if you have any, talk about the new features we just introduced last week with version 3.5, talk about what we'll do next. We do have a poll, so if you would like, you can open that up and answer a couple of questions we have put on there for what we should work on next. So let's get started. I'll talk first about installation and system requirements before I start sharing my screen. And I'll try to answer some common questions I get. So as far as deployment goes, Forensic Email Collector does not have many system requirements. You would want to put it on a computer that has probably a quad-core processor and some RAM and enough storage, hopefully fast storage. The reason for quad-core is the way we do hashing. So Forensic Email Collector hashes its output, and when it does that, it'll use multiple threads. So as you download each message, it'll kick off hashing processes on different threads. So if you have a multi-core processor, you'll see better performance there. And as far as RAM goes, I'll talk more about this in a little bit, but when we make requests to the server for email messages, first we try by batching them together. So we don't request one message at a time and say, give me message 1, wait for it, and get the second message. Instead, we will ask the server, okay, give me messages 1 through 50, and then we'll just wait for the response and start downloading them. So to be able to do that, we need some RAM. And most of the time, email messages are not going to be that large, so you should be fine. But imagine a scenario where we requested a batch of 50 messages, and on average, they're 10 megabytes each, for example. So that would be a chunk of 500 megabytes just to store that response from the server. So, you know, if you have even larger messages, and if you're using a 32-bit operating system, you could run out of process memory. So it's good to have a 64-bit operating system with some RAM so that we could make those batch requests. You know, that's not a deal breaker if you don't have it. What happens is if some of those batch requests are too large that the server doesn't respond to them, or if you don't have enough RAM to handle it, then we will circle back and request them again individually to cover all bases. So it'll still succeed in the end, but you'll see a performance hit. So let me start by sharing my screen here and go through the user interface and some of the features that you may not have paid attention to before, possibly. So let's share the screen here and fire up Forensic Email Collector. Okay. So I'm going to start not in order of the items that we have, but I'll start by talking about settings, which is an area a lot of people don't touch, and there's some important stuff there. So settings start with examiner name and agency. So this is just a way to automatically populate those data points when the acquisition starts. So you see that on step 3, when we enter the email address and specify the connection settings, the next step is to ask for case details. So if you have these entered here and saved, you're not going to have to enter them time after time. You'll just have them here and it'll auto-populate. Number of retries is kind of an important thing, and let's talk about this a little bit. So when Forensic Email Collector is requesting emails, one of the design goals we had was to make sure that acquisitions successfully finish and with minimal babysitting. So to accomplish that, we have two functions essentially. One of them is the automatic retries, which is how you control what you control here, and the other one is the ability to resume. So you can go back and resume a project if it's incomplete. So the number of retries you specify here tells FEC how many times it should retry any failed items before it calls quits. Yeah, you might find it appropriate to have a smaller number there, maybe as little as 3, for example. So it would, FEC would retry a few times and then stop. Or if you are planning to do maybe a long acquisition and maybe you're leaving for the day and you want to just kick it off and hope that it'll be done by the next morning, then you may want to put a larger number there, like 10 or even higher if you wanted to, so that FEC will keep trying time after time. I would suggest as a pro tip that you put a number there that's at least 3. And the reason for that is, remember I talked about how we request messages in bulk most of the time. And then after a few attempts, we will actually request them individually. So that happens every 3rd attempt. So if you put a number there that's 3 or more, then you will give FEC the opportunity to go back and re-request some of the failed messages, if there are any, individually to work around any memory limitations or any instances where you're making a large request to the server and the server doesn't feel like responding to that request because the size is too large. So that's the number of retries, and you'll see in the user interface that there's some question marks here. So if you hover over these, you will see a brief explanation of what that setting does, essentially. Next up is clear token cache, and this has to do with OAuth tokens that we have. So when you authenticate with Google, Gmail, or G Suite, even if you're using IMAP, one of the authentication options we have is OAuth. So that's with the web interface. And when we do that, FEC stores those tokens in a token cache for subsequent requests, if you're resuming the same processing job later, or if it's running for an extended period of time. So we keep a cache of it, but you could go and clean that cache whenever you want to. You may want to do this for a couple of reasons. Number one, you may want to just wipe that out once you're done with that mailbox so that you don't have a cache lying around on your acquisition computer. Or, you know, perhaps credentials change, or you want to use your own API credentials for Gmail and you want to flush out what FEC already has on there. You may want to clear it that way. So if you clean this, if you hit this button, it'll just go and find those tokens. Right now I had 1 token in cache, so I cleared that out. The third one is custom profile path. So this is where Forensic Email stores custom acquisition profiles. This was a requested feature that we implemented probably a few months ago. So if you have some acquisitions that you're working on, and let's say that you're connecting to a server frequently that is not one of the built-in profiles that Forensic Email Collector has, you know, something like Yahoo and Hotmail, for example, but kind of an exotic server. So you may want to save that custom profile so that when you go back and do other mailboxes with the same settings, you don't have to type them up again, you can just pull it up. So this is the path where FEC stores those custom profiles and pulls them up from there. Next up, we have the feature that controls automatic update checks. So if you have this enabled, then in the updates tab, you'll see every once in a while that Forensic Email Collector checked for updates, and it'll tell you if there's a new version available. If you uncheck it, then you can go and hit this button to perform that check manually. Notification emails is kind of a detailed feature, but the summary of it is that let's say you're running a long acquisition and you want to be notified when that's done, and you don't want to sit and wait for it. So you can click this and enable this feature. So you can specify your settings for how that notification should be sent. One of the options we have is to limit the duration of acquisition sessions for which notifications will be sent. And the reason for that is, let's say that you are running a lot of acquisitions, and most of the time they're short and you're in front of the computer, then it may not make sense for forensic email collector to keep sending you emails letting you know because you're already there. So I like to set this at 30 minutes. So if I have a job running for 30 minutes or longer, then most likely I will switch over to another task, and it's good to have a notification email sent to me when the acquisition is complete. Here you can specify how you want the sender and recipient addresses to be populated. So sender is the email account that the notification email will appear to be coming from, and recipient addresses where it'll go. So you could put your own mailbox, or if you have a project management team, you could put a distribution list there that the email will be sent to. And for the settings, the server settings, we have two options. One of them is send directly. So if you choose this option, then forensic email collector will turn this computer where it's running into an SMTP server, and it'll send the email directly from this computer without any third-party server. So this is pretty handy, and I would say that it's probably going to work in most cases, but there might be instances where either this computer you're running FEC is not configured correctly to be an SMTP server. Maybe it doesn't have the ports that are required, or you don't have all the spam handling type settings like reverse DNS and everything set up for that computer. So you might have issues with how the emails are categorized as spam or not. So if you could try this, and if you find that sending directly is being problematic, then I recommend that you use the second option, which is to use a relay server. So in this case, you're essentially using a third-party server that's designed for SMTP relay. It could be a server that you have in your organization already. So an organization might have their own server for all this kind of notification emails from network appliances when they encounter issues and things like that. If you don't have something like this, then you could go get an account from an SMTP service like Mailgun or SendGrid, and enter your username and password and address that they provide for you, and FEC will connect to that and send a notification email. So that's going to be more reliable, and I would recommend it. So we did the notification emails. Maximum wait duration is a setting that we introduced in this version with 3.5. So remember I said that forensic email will retry messages if it encounters any issues, and that's great. But if you have a scenario where maybe you have a time constraint and you don't want the wait time between those attempts to grow longer and longer, which is what FEC does by default, because that's what the servers recommend. So the servers and service providers say that when you request a message, if the request fails, then wait, and next time if it fails again, wait longer and longer until it succeeds, because we don't want you hammering the mailbox. So we heed that warning, and we try to do like an exponential backoff to wait longer and longer. And by default, the cap that we have on this is 1800 seconds. So FEC will wait and wait until 30 minutes between the attempts, the request attempts. But if that's too long for you, then you could put a different cap here, as little as 30 seconds, for example, and have the wait time reduced to kind of compress the whole timeline of the case, essentially. Another thing that FEC does, which is good to mention here, is that when we are doing this type of retry attempts and waiting, if the server we're working with supplies us with a response that tells us how much we should wait, then we try to parse that response and wait until then. Gmail does a good job with this. For example, if you're working with API and it starts throttling you, then it'll give you a response saying, hey, you're making too many requests, please wait until this time, and it'll give you a date and time. So we will parse that date from Gmail's response, and FEC will try and wait until that time comes to not make excessive requests and make the issue even worse. So that's for the settings. So let's talk a little bit about let me roll this back to the default setting here. How we start the acquisition process and what happens when we are collecting emails in the background. So the first step, the first thing you see on the start screen is a couple of options. Number one, you can put in the target email address, and number two, you can resume a previous project. So this will cause a dialog to open where you can browse an older project and resume it. So we can go over that in a little bit. Let's talk a little bit about what happens when you put in a target email address. So let's say that we put something like my email here. So when you hit next, Forensic Email Collector will know that this address is hosted on Office 365. So in the background, it'll do a lookup on the domain to see who's handling the email business for this domain. Essentially, it's called a mail exchanger record lookup on the domain name server for this domain. So you'll see that this works for a number of different providers. So right now we looked it up and it turned out to be Office 365. So it auto-populated for something like, let's put things like .com, for example. Turns out it's on Gmail. If you wanted to do something like Gray.com is on Office 365. I'll put one more. This is on GoDaddy, for example. But what happens if you run into something that FEC doesn't know how to handle or doesn't have a built-in profile for it? So let's try, for instance, something like CNN. Let's say you wanted to collect an email from a custodian at CNN. So when you see this, this is the manual selection screen where Forensic Email Collector doesn't have a profile for the email service that's handling CNN's email. So what would you do if you come across this? So you have a couple of options, but you could do something similar to what Forensic Email Collector does in the background yourself. You could open up a web browser and you could go to MX Toolbox, for example, and put CNN.com. So this is essentially manually performing that type of mail exchanger record lookup. And let's see what we come across here. So we are seeing some mail exchanger records that end with pphosted.com that belong to Proofpoint. So Proofpoint, you'll see that is an email service provider that has a number of services around archival, email security, and things like that. So let's say that you identified your target mailbox as being either on a server that Forensic Email Collector doesn't support or doesn't know of, let's say, or a service like this that provides some added services. Then we have a couple of options. You would probably want to get some documentation either from your client's IT to see what the email settings should be, or you could contact the service provider or check their support documentation to see how you can connect to their services. Most of the time, you would expect that they would have either some IMAP or Exchange connectivity that you can utilize with Forensic Email Collector. One of the reasons that I showed this is because you might come across some instances where you have a custodian that's on Office 365, but there's an intermediary, maybe an managed IT services company that handles archival or spam identification type services for them. So they could insert themselves between Office 365 and the end user and act kind of like a proxy. So if you have a situation like that, then when Forensic Email Collector does the mail exchanger record lookup, it's not going to be able to determine that the email is on Office 365. So you could work around that. If you identify that it is actually on Office 365, then you could create a custom Exchange profile, for example, and then populate the Exchange Web Services URL from Office 365 that you know. If you don't remember that, you can look it up from Forensic Email Collector. You'll see that it lists Office 365's EWS URL here. So you could use this and make a custom Exchange profile out of it, and figure out the Exchange server version for Office 365. It'll be auto-populated. If it's a hosted Exchange account that's on another provider, then you could use Exchange Auto Discover here with this button. Enter the username and password, then Forensic Email Collector will connect to the Exchange server to try and determine what the server version should be that will be used here. We have a few options. So that's the MX lookup functionality that most of the time makes things a little bit easier and saves you some research into figuring out the settings. Now let's talk a little bit about, in the settings tab, we had seen the custom profiles. So let's make a custom profile and see how that works. So let's say that I'm trying to connect to a service like, let's make up a domain like white.com. So FEC doesn't know who handles their email. So let's say we know that this is IMAP and we select IMAP. So we are faced with this custom IMAP creation screen. You could actually select one of the existing profiles that Forensic Email Collector has. But the option you have here is you could set up something like a profile with the settings that specify the SSL mode, how you should handle SSL certificates. And when you're done with this, you could save this profile, give it a name, and save it. So next time you come in and work with that, then you will see those options. I had saved one previously. You will see those options to select from. So when you select it, it'll automatically populate the settings for you. So it's a way to especially make bulk acquisitions from a number of mailboxes on the same custom server a little bit less painful. And while we're here, let's talk about this option that's kind of interesting. So this accept all certificates option is kind of one of the advanced options we have for IMAP. Most of the time, when Forensic Email connects to an IMAP server, most of the time you'll see that our built-in profiles are with SSL, so with some encryption in place. But if you're connecting to a server that has an expired certificate, for example, which could happen, or if you're connecting to something like Proton Mail that requires you to have kind of like your own IMAP server set up on the workstation where you're doing the collection, which is the Proton Mail bridge, then you're not going to have an SSL certificate set up for that local host. So essentially, when FEC tries to connect to it, there's going to be a certificate issue. So if you wanted to work around that, then you could check this accept all SSL certificates option for Proton. It's already pre-selected. Then you can go through with the acquisition and work around that. Another use case for this is that there are some service providers, especially domain registrars that also do email. A lot of times what they'll do is when you have a domain with them and you enable email, in the server settings, they will give you custom host names per domain. So let's say that your domain is white.com and you registered it with a domain registrar and you got email service through them. So you'll see that in your control panel, the mail server address will be mail.white.com, not a central email server that serves everybody. If you don't want to deal with that, and if you want to use their central server, which obviously has a host name that they don't reveal most of the time, you could put it on there as the server address and work with that. Or if you want to use that custom mail server, in this case mail.white.com, then in some cases some mail providers don't have their certificate business in order, so you will have SSL certificate issues connecting to it. So in my experience, a lot of times they recommend that you connect without without SSL, so you could do none and set the port FEC does it automatically to 143, and not worry about the SSL certificates. Or if you wanted to do an SSL collection, then you may want to choose this accept all certificates option so that you don't get stuck on a bad SSL certificate. Here's something else that I want to address before we go forward. This is a question that I get quite often, and before we get into some of the details of what we did in this latest version, let's talk briefly about this. I get a question about, can you run multiple instances of forensic email collector? And you bet, you can open 2 or more, open them up side by side, and you could run multiple acquisitions on the same computer, provided that you have the resources. So I wouldn't recommend doing this, on a shared computer or where CPU and RAM are not that abundant. But if you have a beefy computer with maybe dual processors and plenty of RAM and 64-bit operating system, then yeah, you could launch multiple instances and run them side by side. Before, we had a limitation on this where you could not output to PST on multiple instances at the same time, because Forensic Email Collector used to use Outlook for that. But starting in version 3.4, we do our own PST output, so it's scalable. You don't have to worry about multiple instances writing to PST at the same time. One thing, obviously, that you want to make sure of is that you're not going to want to write to the same output folder in both instances, but we do have some protections in place for that. So when you specify the output folder, if there is already an FEC project file in there, then the second instance will complain and say, you can't write here, choose another folder, essentially. So keep this in mind. This could speed things up when it comes to acquiring mailboxes if you have multiple and you want to kind of run them in parallel at the same time. Okay, so let's talk a little bit now about some of the things that we built into FEC 3.5, so essentially our new features. One of the big things in this new version was that previously Forensic Email Collector was all about email, which kind of makes sense given its name. But there's a lot of expectation that email and calendar items and even notes sometimes go hand in hand, especially because of how Microsoft structured Outlook. So in Outlook, you can access your calendar items. You can put them in the same PST as your email. So it's good to have a solution where you can collect calendars and other related types along with email messages. And we had these requests for Google Calendar for a while now. So a lot of you wanted to be able to authenticate into Google once, and while you're at it, grab the Gmail data and Google Calendar at the same time. And we had this request for Exchange, where Exchange API already lists all these Exchange item types when you get the mailbox list. So you wanted to be able to also gather calendars and some other types along with emails. So that's the big thing in version 3.5, that we kind of branched out into those different data types. So let's start by looking at Gmail and some of the new features we have here. So let's log into this test account we have. So let's stop here for a second and talk about the output options. This is a good point. So one of the new features we have, again, is this duplicate items for each label option. And let me give you a little bit of background on this. Some of you have been using FEC for a long time now, but there are a lot of new users that may not know the background on this. So initially, when we launched FEC, you had 2 options to collect from Gmail like you do now. One of them is via IMAP, and the other is with Gmail API. When you do IMAP, Gmail's IMAP server presents Gmail labels as virtual folders. So you see like a folder view under IMAP, and when you do the acquisition, then all the labels are reflected in your output folder structure. which is convenient and good, but the downside is that you get a lot of duplication, because if you have a message under 5 different labels, then it's listed under 5 different folders, so you get 5 copies of it in your output. So, you know, this gets tremendously big sometimes. And you have this other problem where, because you're downloading so much more, the acquisition takes longer. You're more likely to trigger rate and bandwidth limits and get throttled. You will need more storage, and you know, down the line you have all these issues with having to include all the additional data to duplicates in your subsequent steps, like the duplication, searching, review, production, and all that. So my preferred method has always been to use Gmail API and to uncheck this option. So when you do that, you're essentially getting all the items in the Gmail mailbox in a single folder. That's how Gmail keeps them, actually. So there's no concept of folder in API. They have all the messages, and each message has a number of labels applied to them, kind of like tags. And they can overlap these tags. So this exactly reflects how Gmail stores that information. And when you do it, when you do the acquisition this way, you get all the Gmail messages in the mailbox once and in a simple, straight folder structure. So let's do that. So you see that these settings have been carried over from my settings file. So let me output to a folder here and hit next. You'll see that I'm getting a request for authentication here. You'll see that FEC requests for calendar, view only, and emails now. So let's say allow and get this out of here. All right, so if I did the plain Gmail API output, this is a small mailbox, so it's going to be easy to demonstrate how the different output types look. Then we're going to collect these emails, and they'll look like this. So we'll have an items folder. This used to be called messages. Now it's items because we have different types of items, like calendar types. I only selected mine. So you see that there's this folder called all mail, and all the mail is really in there. And what I like to do personally is to go to the downloaded items log. This is a delimited text file, and this has the message ID, the path where it was written to, and all the labels that were applied to it as a delimited text file. So what I prefer to do is to grab this file and you know, take this output from FEC for my subsequent steps, and maybe ingest it into my forensic tool or review tool, relativity, whatever you use, and then overlay the information in the downloaded items log. Maybe create a field there called Gmail labels, and overlay this label information on there. So you get each message once, and you get to see the Gmail labels in a field that you can search or categorize. You could make it a multi-entry field and all that. So this is a pretty good option, and that's what I like to do. But a lot of you had a desire to see the folder structure reflected in the output. Maybe because, you know, that was an established workflow and it works well, and it cuts out that extra step of overlaying the Gmail label information. So to make that happen, we implemented a couple of options. So the first one was, let's go back to this same mailbox, this option to populate output paths from Gmail labels. So when you choose this option, what Forensic Email does is it'll actually download the message once still. It'll read the labels applied to it, and then it'll do some decision. It'll make a decision there based on the labels that it sees, and it'll favor user labels over system labels, and it'll pick one representative label to output the message under. So you'll see a foldered output, foldered structure in your output folder, but there will only be one copy of each message. So I think this is kind of like a best of both worlds option, where you see a folder structure, but essentially it's kind of like as if you had acquired via IMAP, and then deduplicated the output, so you get one copy of each message. So let's see quickly what that looks like. And these options don't really apply to Google Calendar because Calendar doesn't have that label concept that's applicable to emails. So this is the second option where we have, instead of the all mail folder, now we have actual folders, and folders contain messages. But you'll see that in some cases, there's going to be items with multiple labels, like this one that has category promotions, unread, and inbox, but it's only going to be output under one of the labels. So in this case, it will be inbox probably. So this is another good way, but after we released this in version 3.4, now we got a lot of requests for going a step further and kind of simulating the IMAP output, so that if you see outputs to multiple folders, one per label. So you might think, okay, then why not just use IMAP, because the output is going to be very similar. But the benefit of this option is that with IMAP, you are really downloading those messages multiple times over. So you have that issue where the acquisition takes longer, and you can be capped, you can be throttled. With this option we have with Gmail API, FEC is actually downloading the messages once, just as it does with the other Gmail API options. But when it's writing them, it'll read the list of labels and it'll output them multiple times under each label. So it is a more efficient way to do what you achieve with the IMAP option, essentially. So let's do that. The one thing to be cautious about here is that because of this duplication, similar to IMAP, this could consume a lot of storage, and you wouldn't know about it because you look at this mailbox, for example, and you see that we have items in the 300s, 369 items, but a lot of these are going to have multiple labels. So when Forensic Email Collector duplicates this, you're going to have a lot more items on there. This could be 3 or 4 times more than what you started off with. So it's good to be cautious about how you allocate space for an acquisition like this. For a few hundred messages, no big deal. But let's say you have a mailbox that has 500,000 messages, then I would think twice before doing this, storage-wise at least. So let's see how this works. So I'm going to go ahead and start this, and the process looks very similar. So it's still downloading 369 messages like before, so nothing has changed, and the speed is about the same. This will depend a little bit on how fast you can write to your storage. But when you look at the output, you'll see that there are more folders here, and we didn't download only 369 messages. Well, we downloaded 369, but we didn't write 369. We have now 452 messages written here. And you'll see that some of these ID numbers are duplicates. For example, look at these two. So in this last two, you see that 369 is the ID for 2 different rows in this output list. And that's because we have 2 labels applied to this message. So we have inbox and contract dispute. So if you look at how it was output, in one instance, it was output under inbox, and in the second instance, it was output under contract dispute. So there will be 2 copies of this. We hash each copy separately, but even then, the hashes should match, obviously, because it's the same message. Here we have an instance where there are even more copies of the same item. I see 1, 2, 3, 4 copies of it because of the labels. So we still kept the IDs the same for a couple of reasons. Number one, this makes it clear where the duplication is happening, so you can see clearly which messages have been duplicated. And also, if you still wanted to do this overlay of the label information onto the database, then that's easy too. You can just grab a list of the labels and overlay by identifier, and they will match by message ID. Even the multiple copies will have the same message ID. So if you're overlaying anything on them, you could have that only once and overlay it onto the multiple copies of it at the same time. So this is a good option for those of you that really like the IMAP output style. One thing to note here is that when we pick these labels to output under, by looking at the output from Gmail's IMAP server, we saw that IMAP server doesn't list all the labels. Some system labels like category promotions, unread, category updates are suppressed. So the IMAP server is not going to list those messages under those labels. So we try to do the same. We mimic the output of the IMAP server and we suppress those labels as well. So you might see that this message has 3 labels applied to it: unread, category updates, and inbox. But we didn't output it under unread and category updates. We only have 1 copy under inbox, which is how the IMAP output would look like. So that's something to keep in mind. You can read more about this in the output settings documentation we have here. Let me open up our documentation, and under Gmail we have a document about Gmail output options, so you can read this to get a good sense of all the 4 different options we have, including IMAP. So now that we looked at that, let's think a little bit about the new options we had for Gmail, especially Google Calendar. So let's open up a new acquisition here, go into the same mailbox. Skip over this. Okay, so you'll see that when Forensic Email Collector connects to a mailbox now and gets the mailbox listing, it'll list the emails there, and then it has a section here for Google Calendars. So this is, we wanted to keep this all on the same page to be consistent with how we do it with Exchange, although there's some underlying differences. In Exchange, really with the Exchange Web Services API, we are getting all the calendar notes and all that information along with email in the same mailbox. With Google, these are 2 distinct APIs. So now Forensic Email Collector is connecting to Gmail API to get the message information, and we are connecting to a whole separate API called Google Calendar API to get the calendar information. But we kind of combine them in the same screen here so you can see them side by side. One thing to note here is that when it comes to running searches, so right now I selected only the email folder. So if I launch Search Console, you'll see that there's a tab now here called Gmail, and you can run the same searches that you ran before. But if you actually select the calendar folder and launch Search Console, then you'll see a Google Calendar tab with a slightly different user interface. And the reason for that difference is because, like I said, it's a whole different API. It has different search capabilities and a different search structure generally, so I'll talk about that in a little bit. If you select both of them, then you'll see 2 tabs. So you can run your searches here for Gmail and run your searches here for Google Calendar. So let's look into the search options we have here. So for Gmail, I went over this in other webinars, but generally, Google has pretty strong search capabilities for Gmail. You can hit this syntax help button here and get a feel for what search options are available. We updated this documentation to reflect the tabs as well. But you can do things like around, after, date parameters and things like that, and you can combine them and create some pretty large queries. One thing that we changed in the Search Console for Gmail is that we implemented a slight minor syntax check and correction capability because Gmail Search Console has some quirks about how you have to structure things, and if you don't, then that can trip you up, and we don't want people to make simple mistakes there and have issues with the searches. So we had a couple of changes here that make things easier. For example, if you wanted to run a search like this, you actually have to capitalize the Boolean term here. And if you didn't, it would not work. But we updated FEC to do that for you now and detect it. So you'll see that it'll get automatically capitalized and the search will work. And similarly, let's say that we're searching for something like this with a date restriction. So this is an illegal way to format dates in Google. It wants it to be year, 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 month, month, day, day. So if you do a search like this, then we will put a warning here for you saying that 8/1/2018 doesn't look like the right format. How about you try this? If you run it, you can, but you're not going to get anything. So you would want to go back and edit your search and make that correction. Here's another tip that I don't think I've mentioned this before, but it's a good time to talk about this. So let's go back here to the Search Console. So let's say that I have a pretty complex search query that I want to run with multiple Boolean operators and a large mailbox that contains maybe tens of thousands of messages. And I know that my query is right because I've run it on different mailboxes before, or perhaps I practiced it on Gmail's web interface, and I know it works. If you wanted to save time and not wait for the search results, although it's most of the time instantaneous for Gmail at least, or if you wanted to save those, save the bandwidth and your allocation towards the rate and API limits for throttling, then you could actually skip the preview step. So let's say that I want to search for Ghostbusters, right? So most of the time, the intuition would be to hit this button to get a preview of this, but you don't have to do that in some cases. So you could simply just save this without running it and go through with the acquisition, and it would still work. The beauty of the preview is just to confirm that the query is actually working like you anticipated. And, you can run it and get the results and then save it if you prefer that. Same thing applies to Google Calendar as well. So you can construct your query here and you don't have to run it right then and there. So here's an important difference between Google Calendar search and Gmail search. When you search Gmail, all your search goes in here, and this query can be quite complex with Boolean operators and date parameters and all that. When you do Google Calendar, this here is just a keyword that you can use to search within your calendar items. You cannot put Boolean operators, date restrictions, and the complex elements there that you could in Gmail. That's how Google Calendar API works. So you could put a keyword here right, like this and run a search on Google Calendar. And I see here that I have a calendar item here that says take Sadie to dog school. There's a description of that item. There is the start and end times in coordinated universal time. So here is what these items come into play. So these date pickers here are to specify start and end points for your appointments if you want to filter them. So this controls essentially when the appointments start, and this controls when they end, and you don't have to populate both of them. So you could do a one-ended search, like I want to get all the calendar items that start after a certain date, or all of the ones that end before a certain date, or both of them start after and end before, to kind of narrow it down. Again, you can find the syntax app for this in the same Search Console page we have. So you can, we ran this search, and we can go back and put a search in Gmail to, like I had before, something like this. And then you save, this will save both of your searches because you have both of those selected, and then you can go and run your acquisition here. So we connected to Google API and Gmail API and Calendar API here, and we got both of them. So now folder is called items, like I said, and you'll see that we have this item, which was one of the labels applied to this message from Gmail. And we have a special folder here called Google Calendars, where all the calendar information goes. And when you look at this, you'll see that this is the calendar that we selected, and this is the item in iCalendar format. So this is essentially a pretty universal format for saving calendar items, and we save them individually. So you will see that we have a number of items individually here. Something to show here again is that under logs now we have an update, and when we connect to Google Calendar, now we also get a listing of the calendars in that account and include that in the acquisition log for future reference. So in this case, I see that was a calendar for this mailbox. It was in this time zone for Los Angeles. It was selected, so it was showing in the user's calendars. And you can see it's foreground and background colors. So these are essentially the colors that you have representing that calendar when you look at the calendar view. I would imagine most of the time you probably wouldn't care too much about that, but if you have a case where you maybe saw a screenshot of a calendar and you know the color, then you could check that to make sure that that's that calendar by color. So here I have a few other calendars, one for US holidays that Google must have added to this account. And the rest is pretty much the log that you're used to seeing. So this is what we did for Google Calendar. I forgot to do the MSG version of this, so let's do that so you can see both. So let's select the MSG option 2, and then let's choose these couple of items. So we're going to see the emails in both formats and the calendar items in both formats. So I wanted to show you how we write the calendar items from Google individually and how we write the MSG version of them as well. So individually, like I said, calendars look like this as iCalendar items. And when you look at the MSG version, so they look like the Google Calendar items. Let me see. This is the one that I was talking about earlier. So it'll look like a meeting request or an appointment in Google that you can process. So let's look at now. Let's see if I have. Let's look at now how we do the different item types in Exchange. So this was one of the requested features that we tackled in 3.5. So let's take a look at a mailbox here. Grab the passcode from this. Okay. And I'm going to select both of these output options. And let's talk about the output options too in a little bit, but let's skip over that for now. So when we fetch the mailbox, this actually hasn't changed compared to before. We were always getting the entire mailbox tree, and we still do. And the calendars and notes and all those items are already in there. So just to show you quickly, so I'm going to select the calendars, contacts, and notes here, which are some of the new items we have. And I'm going to run an acquisition for these. And FEC will get the calendars from the calendar folder. The other ones were too quick. Okay, so let's take a look. So it looks similar to how we had it for Gmail. So calendar items will be iCalendar format. Contacts will be vCard format, VCF under MIME. And notes will be in EML format. So the goal here is, under MIME, we have them in more universal formats that you could use pretty much anywhere. And most of the time, these will be the original format you get these items in. And under MSG, you'll see a converted version of these. So let's pull up this. So this is the webinar calendar item I had for this webinar, actually. So that's how a calendar item looks. Contacts are going to look like contacts in Outlook. And notes are going to look like notes that you see the sticky notes. They will have, they can have different colors. We captured that as well. It'll look something like this. So the date here is the date from the note. That's how Outlook presents them. So this is yesterday. That's about when I created these notes for this in preparation for the webinar. Here's another one. So yeah, the goal here is basically that you can just grab these and throw them into your rediscovery processing solution and process them or examine them or use them however you want it to. And same goes for PST too, so you could also choose the PST option to get all three of them. So back to the output options. Yeah, so I wanted to go and stop here for a second and talk about the output options. This is something that I've spoken to a number of you before, but I wanted to emphasize this one more time. So you may think that, let's say that we connect to an Exchange mailbox. You may think that when we collect from Exchange, we get these email items as MSGs from the server or as a PST, but that's not the case. In all these server types, from Gmail API, from IMAP, and from Exchange with Exchange Web Services API, we get these messages in internet message format, which is essentially MIME. So that corresponds to the first output option, the MIME EML output option. So that's how they're transmitted over the wire, over the internet, and that's how Forensic Email Collector gets them. And that's why here in the tooltip here, we recommend this format for forensic preservation. So my suggestion is to not uncheck this option because that's the closest you get to native, or in this case, near native format for these items. Then, we have the MSG and PST formats for more of a convenience option where you can convert those to those formats. And, if your e-discovery tools or forensic tools work better with those formats, you can have that. But again, don't uncheck the MIME format because there could be things there that, especially in a forensic authentication type scenario, you would want to get closest to the original file that you have, and that would be a good starting point for looking at your message identifiers, the multi-part MIME delimiters and things like that, to look in the original MIME format first. So, when you do that type of work, you would want to get that MIME format, and FEC is actually pretty well suited for that type of work because you can search. So you could actually search a mailbox, get a date range from there, or get a list of messages that are kind of related to your forensic review and acquire them and do that type of forensic analysis. So that's something I wanted to mention about the output formats, because I have heard that, we made this an option that you can uncheck this, which is good, but a lot of you uncheck it because you don't maybe use it. But I would say that, unless you have a huge storage issue, I would keep it checked just for future reference, just so you have a copy of the message in its original form. And you can verify this too. So if you went to, for example, Yahoo's web interface and looked at the Yahoo message by going to the view raw message option and saved it, and then downloaded the same message through FEC, then they will match. They're going to have the same hash. So that's exactly the same message, and that's the same goes for Gmail and other types as well. So keep that option checked. One thing that I wanted to also talk about was, I skipped over that pretty quickly, but let's go back to the Exchange item types and Exchange search. We kind of glossed over that quickly. So let me go back to the same mailbox I had. So when we were running searches before, we were using the Search Console here for Exchange, and that hasn't changed because, like I said, we are still using one API for Exchange, and it works through all the item types. So you could, for example, run a search within nodes and search for a specific node like this, and you'll find it. In this case, you'll get the date of the node. There's not going to be from and to type information, but the size, and in the subject, you'll get the node's details. So I think I have another node like this here. Yeah, so this is a little bit more detail on the node and the date and stuff. So just to show that this is essentially an all-encompassing search. You don't have to run separate searches for calendar and notes and mail and contact items. This is all integrated in the Exchange search thanks to the Exchange API. It's different than Google's API. Let's see. Well, it looks like we just hit the 1 hour mark here, and I am actually wrapping up what I had prepared for this webinar as well. So I wanted to see if there are any questions that you would like me to answer. Let's see, let me stop my screen here for a second. If you had questions, I didn't mention this, but there's a Q&A section here. Under the in your screen, there's a Q&A button, so you can hit that Q&A button and open a question there if you wanted to. There's one here. Let's see. Oh, there's a question about multiple queries in Gmail. So how do we combine those multiple queries? Yeah, that's a very good question. So you would combine them with the Boolean operators. You don't have to have multiple queries as different inputs. So let's say that okay, let's see. So let's say that we are doing something like this and I want to run a search. What I was saying was that I could have a number of search terms listed in my text editor like this, with different criteria, perhaps individual date restrictions for each search term, or maybe a global date restriction. And then I would turn it into a combined search query in my text editor. You could do something like this. I'm going to use outrated because I like it, but you could use whatever is your preferred method. And then I'm going to replace these line breaks with some ORs and turn that into a composite search that carries all those search terms, and then you can go and paste that into forensic email collector. So each term is within parentheses, and you have ORs combining the different terms. So that's how you would combine multiple terms. So in response to that, I was saying we are thinking about building some functionality around this to, number one, automate this, and number two, generate search reports for each segment of the search. So you get maybe a file that shows you we ran this line of the search and we got this many hits type thing. All right. So let's see. I see a question about output paths. Yeah, so that's an interesting one. So here's a question about the output paths. I'm assuming you're talking about something like this. So let's say that I'm doing a collection here, and I selected an output path. Like this. And then I changed my mind about something like this, and I went back and I wanted to redo the collection. What happens to that, and how can I work around it? So that's a good question, and that is something I'm aware of. What happens is once you start the collection and pull the folder tree from the email server, then we're going to create the project at that point. At that point, and we're going to start creating our log too, because there's already some communication with the server taking place, especially for IMAP. We're going to put some mailbox listing logs and things like that. So we don't want to lose that information. So we start populating the project folder at that point. And we don't want to have you write to the same project folder because of what I explained earlier, because you could have multiple instances outputting simultaneously, or that could be a user error where you accidentally put a folder where you had a project before, and that would cause FEC to overwrite some of the information you had on there, which would not be good. So currently, when FEC detects something like this, it does two things. Number one, it'll check your output folder to see if there's an existing FEC project file there. If there is a project file there, then it's not going to allow you to write there because of what I described. If there is no project file there, but there's some information, it's not an empty folder. Let's say this, and something like this. Then it'll say, okay, you're writing to this folder, and it's not empty, but it doesn't have a project file here, so it's unlikely that this is an FEC output folder. Are you sure you want to write to this folder, or should we write somewhere else? So you could decide what to do there. So currently, to answer the question here, my chosen method right now is to just increment the folder number if I change my mind, and if I'm going back to redo it, I would just say T3 and go from there. But it's, if that sounds like something that you don't want to do and you want to be able to keep writing to the same folder, then let me know. Like I said, I'm a little bit concerned about writing into the output of an existing folder, but here's something we could probably do. We could check the output folder to see if an items folder has been created yet. Because if an items folder has been created, then that means that if it's already output to that folder before, so you definitely don't want to write there again unless you're resuming an older project. But if there is no items folder, then this is likely a folder of maybe a failed attempt, maybe you put in the wrong password. So then we can detect that and allow you to write there, maybe just keep appending to the logs or create a new log there and go from there. Let me know if that sounds like a good idea, and that would be pretty easy to implement. I think it would save some time too when you're doing multiple takes just to get the settings right or the password right or something like that. Yeah, so that sounds like a good idea based on the feedback I'm getting, so we'll do that. One thing that I didn't get into too much in this one, actually not at all, was to resume. So before I close, let me show you that too. Most of you probably already use this, but if you don't, this is something you should know. So when you're doing an acquisition from whatever provider, it could be Gmail or IMAP or Exchange. And the acquisition starts, and let's say that something happens and it doesn't finish completely. We changed the language here a little bit thanks to a suggestion from one of our users, and we included some language here saying that you could actually resume this project and finish it. And here's how you would resume it. For those of you who haven't tried this before, you have two options. You could either open a new instance of FEC and go and hit this link and find this project file, or you could go to the output folder of the last project, that project that didn't finish, and double click this project file, and it'll reload in FEC, and you'll see that it'll show only the items that are remaining, and you'll have the option to either resume this and just get the remaining items like I'll do now, or if you wanted to, instead of getting the actual items as full messages, you could just get metadata for those items. And the metadata would include things like message IDs, dates, times, senders, recipients, and that kind of information where you could use to determine if that message is important to your case, if it's something that you're not able to acquire for whatever reason. All right, it looks like I've answered all the questions, and I'm done with the agenda that I had for today. So I'm going to be wrapping up. Thank you all for joining, and have a good rest of your day.